When a cocky billionaire bets on love, he targets the wrong woman. Elle Monroe, a secret heiress with her own agenda. What begins as a game of deception turns into a journey of transformation, for both. But can love survive when the truth comes? Out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Nate Grant stood in front of the floor-length mirror in his penthouse apartment, adjusting his designer tie. At 36 years old, he had everything money could buy: a successful business empire, a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, and more cars than he could drive in a month. The tabloids called him one of New York's most eligible bachelors, but Nate wasn't interested in settling down. He preferred the company of his wealthy friends and the endless string of glamorous parties that filled his nights. "Another day, another million," he said to his reflection, practicing his signature smirk. His phone buzzed with messages from his friends, already planning tonight's entertainment at his favorite exclusive club. That evening, surrounded by his usual crowd at the VIP section of Club Azure, Nate was in his element. Crystal champagne bottles arrived at their table with sparklers, while beautiful people competed for his attention. His friend Tyler raised a glass, already drunk on expensive liquor. "You know what your problem is, Nate?" Tyler slurred, spilling champagne on his custom suit. "You're too perfect. Everything comes too easy for you." Jessica, a model who had been trying to catch Nate's eye all night, laughed. "Is that even a problem?" "It is," Tyler insisted, getting louder. "I bet you couldn't get someone to fall for you if they didn't know about your money. The real you without all this." He waved his hand at their luxurious surroundings. Nate's other friends joined in, their voices getting more excited as the alcohol flowed. "That's it," said Marcus, another trust fund kid who'd never worked a day in his life. "We should make a bet. See if the great Nathaniel Grant can make someone fall in love with him without using his money." The idea caught fire around the table. These were people who treated life like a game, always looking for new ways to entertain themselves. Nate leaned back, enjoying the attention as his friends got more and more worked up about the idea. "But it can't be just anyone," Jessica chimed in, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "It has to be someone totally opposite to your usual type, someone who would never normally give you the time of day." Tyler suddenly stood up, almost knocking over their drinks. "I've got it. You have to marry them. Anyone can get a date, but marriage, that's the ultimate proof." The table erupted in laughter and excited chatter. Nate felt the familiar rush he got whenever a challenge presented itself. He'd never lost a bet in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. "Fine," he said, raising his glass, "but I get to pick the target. And when I win, you all have to admit that I'm the greatest." His friends cheered, already pulling out their phones to draw up the terms of the bet. They decided on a deadline: 3 months to get married, and a substantial cash prize that meant nothing to any of them, but made the game more official. The next morning, nursing a hangover in his favorite coffee shop, Nate spotted her. A black woman sat on a bench outside, wearing mismatched clothes that had seen better days. She had a battered backpack beside her and was writing something in a worn notebook. People walked past her like she was invisible, which made her perfect for his plan. "This is going to be too easy," Nate muttered to himself, straightening his jacket. In his mind, he was already planning how to approach her, what story to spin. He'd play the role of the kind-hearted businessman, offering to help her get back on her feet. She'd be so grateful for his attention that saying yes to his proposal would be inevitable. What Nate didn't notice was the sharp intelligence in the woman's eyes as she watched him approach, or the slight smile that played across her lips. He had no idea that Elle Monroe, heiress to one of the largest private fortunes in America, had already heard about his bet through her connections in high society. She'd been waiting for him to take the bait, curious to see just how far this arrogant millionaire would go. As Nate walked toward her, practicing his most charming smile, Ella quietly closed her notebook. Inside were detailed notes about the local homeless community she'd been helping through her foundation's outreach program. She'd spent the past year working undercover, learning firsthand about the struggles of those she wanted to help. Now it seemed she had a new project, teaching Nathaniel Grant a lesson about the true value of a person. "Excuse me," Nate said, his voice dripping with fake concern. I couldn't help but notice you seem like you could use some help. Ella looked up at him, playing her part perfectly. That's very kind of you, she said softly, making her voice sound timid and grateful. Inside, she was already planning how to turn his cruel game into a lesson he'd never forget. The trap was set, but neither of them knew just how completely it would change both their lives. Ella kept her eyes down as Nate sat next to her on the bench, trying not to laugh at how pleased he looked with himself. He really thought this was going to be easy. I've seen you here a few times, Nate lied smoothly, even though this was the first time he'd noticed her. I hate seeing someone in trouble when I could help. That's very kind, Elle said quietly, clutching her old notebook closer. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting how he kept glancing at his expensive watch. He couldn't even pretend to care for 5 minutes without checking the time. I'm Nate Grant, he said, flashing what he thought was his most charming smile. I run several successful businesses in the city. Maybe we could get some coffee and talk about how I might be able to help you. Elle had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing. She'd been at the same charity gala as him last month, though he'd been too busy showing off to notice her in her designer gown. I'm Ella, she said simply, leaving off her last name. But I wouldn't want to waste your time. Nonsense. Nate said too quickly, already thinking about how impressed his friends would be. Let me buy you breakfast, you must be hungry. Over breakfast at the coffee shop, Elle played her part perfectly. She let Nate talk about himself, watching how he barely asked her any questions about her own life. He was too busy trying to impress her with stories about his wealth and success. You know, Nate said, leaning forward like he was sharing a secret, I believe everything happens for a reason. Meeting you today, I feel like it was meant to be. Elle pretended to wipe her mouth to hide her smile. Her friend Sarah, who worked as a waitress in the coffee shop and knew exactly who Elle was, kept making faces behind Nate's back every time she passed their table. I know this might sound crazy, Nate continued, reaching for her hand across the table, but I believe in following my heart. What if I told you I could give you a whole new life? A life where you'd never have to worry about anything again? What exactly are you saying? Ella asked, making her voice shake just a little. Marry me, Nate said, trying to look sincere. I know it's sudden, but when you know, right? Elle made a show of looking shocked, her hand flying to her mouth. But you don't even know me, she protested weakly, knowing it would only make him push harder. I know enough, Nate insisted, already planning how to tell his friends. I know you have a good heart. I can see it in your eyes, and I know I want to take care of you. Elle pretended to think it over, watching Nate try not to look too impatient. If you're sure, she said finally, letting her voice trail off uncertainly. Absolutely sure, Nate said quickly, pulling out his phone. In fact, I know a judge who could marry us today. Why wait? Ella hid her triumph behind a nervous smile. Today, well, I suppose, if you think it's best. Nate made some quick calls, barely containing his excitement. Within hours, they were standing in front of a judge in the courthouse. Nate had called his friends to witness his romantic gesture, and they stood around trying not to snicker. Ella wore the same shabby clothes, clutching her old backpack like a lifeline. She'd insisted on not wanting new clothes yet, claiming she was too overwhelmed. Really, she wanted Nate's friends to see exactly what kind of man he was, marrying someone just to win a bet. The ceremony was quick and simple. Elle signed the marriage certificate with trembling fingers. Careful to use her real full name, Nate was too busy grinning at his friends to even notice. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Grant, the judge said, looking slightly confused by the unusual couple. Nate's friends crowded around him, patting him on the back and making jokes about his charitable work. None of them even bothered to speak to Elle. Well, Mrs. Grant, Nate said, turning to Elle with a triumphant smile. Ready to see your new home? Of course, husband, Ella replied softly, following him out of the courthouse. As they walked to his car, she sent a quick text to her assistant. Everything's ready at the penthouse. Time for phase 2. Nate drove them to his building, bragging about his penthouse the whole way. He barely noticed that Elle wasn't really listening. She was too busy thinking about the surprise she had waiting for him. As they rode up in the private elevator, Nate was already planning how to handle the marriage, a few months of playing the devoted husband, then a generous divorce settlement to keep her quiet, simple and clean. But when the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, he had no idea that his simple plan was about to blow up in his face. Ella walked into his home like she owned it, a small smile playing on her lips. It was time for Nathaniel Grant to learn that appearances could be very, very deceiving. "Make yourself comfortable," Nate said as they entered his penthouse, watching Ella look around with what he thought was awe. "I'll get us some champagne to celebrate." "Actually," Ella said, her voice suddenly different, stronger and more confident, "I think I'll freshen up first. Where's your bedroom?" Nate pointed down the hall, already loosening his tie and thinking about how easy this had all been. He heard Ella close the bedroom door and walk to his bar to pour himself a drink. He needed to call Tyler and the others, let them know he'd won the bet. "I hope you don't mind," Ella's voice came from behind him 15 minutes later, "but I borrowed something from my closet." Nate turned around, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. Elle stood in the doorway, but she was completely transformed. Gone were the shabby clothes and messy hair. Instead, she wore an elegant black dress that fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and a diamond necklace sparkled at her throat. "What? How?" Nate stammered, stumbling backward. "Surprised to see me in my own clothes?" Elle asked, walking toward him with the confidence of someone who had grown up in mansions. "Or surprised that your little game didn't go quite as planned?" "Your clothes?" Nate's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" Ella smiled, but it wasn't the timid smile from earlier. This was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Elle Monroe," she said, extending her hand like they were meeting for the first time. "Of the Boston Monroes. You know, the family. That owns half the real estate on the East Coast." Nate felt the blood drain from his face. Everyone knew the Monroe name. They made his fortune look like pocket change. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Is it?" Elle walked to his bar and poured herself a drink, completely at home. "I've been watching you, Nate, ever since I heard about your little bet at Club Azure. Did you really think news of something that juicy wouldn't make its way through our social circles?" Nate collapsed onto his couch, his mind spinning. "But Heather clothes, sitting outside the coffee shop. I've spent the past year working undercover with my foundation," Elle explained, sitting across from him. "We help homeless people get back on their feet. I wanted to understand their struggles firsthand. Then I heard about your bet. And well," she shrugged elegantly, "I couldn't resist teaching you a lesson." "So this was all a trap?" Nate's voice rose. "You tricked me." "No, Nate, you tricked yourself." Ella's voice was calm but firm. "You were so busy looking down on someone you thought was beneath you that you never bothered to really see me at all." "Fine." Nate stood up, trying to regain control. "You've had your fun. We'll get this marriage annulled and—" "Oh, I don't." "Think so?" Elle interrupted, pulling out her phone. "You see, I've been recording everything, every conversation where you talked about the bet, every moment you spent bragging to your friends about tricking a homeless woman into marriage." She played a clip of Nate's voice, making him wince. "How do you think the press would react to this story?" "What do you want?" Nate asked, slumping back down. "I want you to experience what it's like to not have everything handed to you," Elle said. "This marriage is going to last for 1 year. During that time, you're going to work at my foundation. No more parties, no more expensive clubs. You're going to learn what it means to actually help people instead of using them for your entertainment. And if I refuse, then these recordings go public and your reputation is ruined." Elle stood up, smoothing her dress. "Your choice." Nate looked at her with new eyes, seeing for the first time the strength and intelligence he'd completely missed before. "Why go through all this trouble? Why not just expose me?" "Because I saw something in you," Elle said more softly. "Behind all that arrogance, there might be a decent person trying to get out. I'm giving you a chance to find him." Just then, Nate's phone started buzzing with messages from his friends, wanting to know how his new bride was settling in. Ella raised an eyebrow at him. "Well, husband?" she asked. Ready to tell them the truth? Or should we let them figure it out at the charity gala next week? Nate looked at his phone, then at Elle, realizing his life had just changed completely. The woman he thought would be an easy mark had turned out to be his perfect match in cunning and determination. And somehow, despite his anger and embarrassment, he found himself intrigued. 1 year, he asked finally. 1 year, Elle confirmed. Think of it as a chance to become someone worth marrying. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the penthouse windows, Nate Grant faced the first challenge he couldn't buy or charm his way out of. And Elle Monroe wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or found the perfect way to transform a shallow millionaire into a man worth loving. The morning after Elle's revelation, Nate woke up on his living room couch with a pounding headache. For a moment he hoped it had all been a bad dream. But then he heard movement in the kitchen and smelled coffee brewing. Elle was already dressed in a crisp business suit, looking every inch the powerful heiress she was. "Good morning, husband," she said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "Ready for your first day of work?" "Work?" Nate rubbed his temples. "What are you talking about?" "The Monroe Foundation opens at 9, Elle said, checking her watch. "And you, my dear, are our newest volunteer coordinator." "I'm not working at your foundation," Nate protested. "I have my own businesses to run." Elle smiled sweetly. "Your business partner called earlier. I told him you're taking a sabbatical for personal growth. He seemed quite understanding." Before Nate could argue, his phone buzzed with messages from his friends. They wanted to meet for lunch at their usual expensive restaurant. Ella picked up his phone and read the messages. "You should tell them you'll be busy," she said. "Unless you want me to tell them why you really married me?" Nate grabbed his phone and typed out a quick excuse. His hands were shaking with anger, but he knew he was trapped. "Fine, 1 day at your foundation, but this is ridiculous." "Oh, sweetie," Elle patted his cheek. "Not 1 day, remember? 1 year." The Monroe Foundation was nothing like Nate expected. Located in a renovated warehouse in a rough part of town, it was bustling with activity. People lined up outside seeking help with housing, job training, and medical care. "Maria will show you the ropes," Elle said, introducing him to a stern-looking woman in her 50s. "And Nate, try not to mention that you own 3 Ferraris." Maria put Nate to work immediately, having him sort through donation boxes. His designer suit got dusty as he dug through piles of used clothes and household items. "These designer labels go in a special pile," Maria explained. "We can sell them to fund our programs." Nate recognized several items he'd thrown away last season. He'd never thought about where his discarded clothes ended up. By lunchtime, his back was aching and his hands were dirty. He watched enviously as his phone lit up with pictures from his friends at their usual restaurant. "Hungry?" A young woman named Jasmine appeared beside him with a sandwich from the foundation's cafeteria. "First day's always the hardest." "How long have you worked here?" Nate asked, trying to be polite. 3 years, Jasmine smiled. "Ever since Miss Monroe helped me get off the streets and into college. Now I run the youth program." Nate took a bite of his sandwich, surprised to find it was actually good. "Ella helped you personally?" "Oh, yeah, she's amazing," Jasmine said enthusiastically. "She doesn't just throw money at problems, she gets involved, really listens to people. Last year, she even lived on the streets for a while to understand what we go through." Nate nearly choked on his sandwich, so that hadn't been a lie. The afternoon got worse. Maria had him help with intake interviews, listening to people tell their stories of job loss, medical bills, and bad luck. Each story made him more uncomfortable, thinking about how he'd blown more money on single nights out than these people had to live on for months. At 4 o'clock, Elle appeared in the doorway of the intake room. "Ready to go home, darling?" Nate practically ran for the door, but Elle stopped him. "Maria, how did he do today?" "Surprisingly, he didn't completely mess up," Maria said grudgingly. "But he needs to work on his attitude." "Don't worry," Elle smiled. "We have plenty of time for that." In the car ride home, Nate was unusually quiet. Elle watched him from the corner of her eye, noticing how he kept looking out the window at the people on the street. "Rough first day?" she asked. "Why do you care?" Nate snapped. "This is all just a game to you, right? Humiliating me to teach me a lesson?" No, Nate, Elle's voice was serious. This isn't a game. These are people's lives. The question is, are you finally ready to see that? Back at the penthouse, Nate's phone buzzed again. Tyler had sent a message. How's married life with your charity case? When do we get to meet her? Nate stared at the message for a long time. For the first time, the joke didn't seem funny. Your friends want to meet me? Elle asked, reading over his shoulder. They don't know who you are yet, Nate said quietly. Well then, Elle smiled, that dangerous smile again. Maybe it's time for a dinner party. Friday night? Nate looked at her in alarm. You want to invite them here? Of course, Elle said sweetly. They should meet their friend's new wife, unless you'd rather I introduce myself at the country club. As Elle walked away to make dinner plans, Nate collapsed onto the couch. One day down, 364 to go. And somehow he had a feeling they were only going to get more challenging. In the kitchen, Ella smiled to herself as she heard Nate groan. Phase 1 of her plan was working perfectly. Now she just had to hope she could get through the year without actually strangling her new husband. Friday night arrived too quickly for Nate's liking. He paced around the penthouse, watching the staff Elle had hired set up for dinner. Everything looked perfect, which only made him more nervous. Stop fidgeting, Elle said, appearing from the bedroom. She wore a red designer dress that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Your friends will be here any minute. Maybe we should cancel, Nate suggested desperately. Tell them you're sick and miss all the fun? Ella adjusted his tie with a smile that made him sweat. Don't worry, darling, I'll be on my best behavior. The doorbell rang and Nate's heart nearly stopped. Tyler and Jessica arrived first, followed quickly by Marcus and his latest girlfriend. They all carried expensive wine bottles and wore expressions of barely hidden amusement. Where's the blushing bride? Tyler asked loudly, looking around the penthouse. Still getting cleaned up? Actually, Elle's voice came from behind them, smooth as silk. I'm right here. Nate watched his friends' faces as they turned around. Their expressions changed from mocking smiles to shock in an instant. Elle stood there looking like she'd stepped off the cover of a magazine, expertly holding a glass of champagne. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, she said, extending her hand. Elle Monroe Grant. So lovely to finally meet my husband's closest friends. The room went completely silent. Jessica's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Monroe? Marcus choked out. As in, the Monroe family? Yes, Elle smiled. Nate's been helping me with some charity work lately. Isn't that right, darling? Nate nodded weakly, watching his friends try to process what was happening. Tyler's face had gone pale. But we saw you, Tyler stammered. Outside the coffee shop. Oh, you mean during my undercover work? Elle laughed lightly. I spend a lot of time in the field for my foundation. It's so important to understand the people we're trying to help. I'm sure Nate's told you all about our work. The dinner that followed was excruciating. Ella played her role perfectly, telling stories about charity galas and family connections that made Nate's friends squirm. In their seats, she casually mentioned mutual acquaintances with their parents, dropping names that made them realize just how much social power she held. It's funny, she said during dessert. I actually saw some of you at the governor's ball last month. I was with my father, of course. We were discussing the new wing we're adding to the children's hospital. Jessica, who had been trying to get an invitation to that ball for years, looked like she might cry. So, Tyler, Elle turned to him with a sweet smile. Nate mentioned something about a bet you all made, something about marriage. Tyler nearly choked on his wine. We were just joking around. Of course you were. Elle patted his hand. I'm sure none of you would actually bet on something as sacred as marriage. That would be cruel. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of uncomfortable silences and nervous laughter. By the time Nate's friends practically ran for the elevator, he felt completely drained. Well, that was fun, Elle said, kicking off her heels. Your friends seem lovely. You destroyed them, Nate said, collapsing onto the couch. No, darling, they destroyed themselves. I just held up a mirror. Elle sat beside him. How does it feel to be on the other side of the joke? Nate was quiet for a long moment. They're not really my friends, are they? Now you're getting it, Elle said softly. Real friends don't treat people like entertainment. They don't make bets about breaking hearts. Is that why you're doing this? Nate turned to look at her. To break my heart? No, Nate. Elle's voice was serious. I'm doing this to help you find your heart. There's a difference. Later that night, as Elle slept in the guest room, Nate stood at his window looking out over the city. His phone had been buzzing all evening with messages from his friends, all of them suddenly eager to apologize, to claim they never meant any harm. But for the first time in his life, he didn't answer them. Instead, he thought about the people he'd met at the foundation, about Jasmine, who worked her way through college while helping others, about Maria, who'd given up a corporate career to work with the homeless, about Elle, who could have lived a life of pure luxury, but chose to get her hands dirty making real change. His reflection in the window showed him the same handsome face, the same expensive clothes. But something in his eyes looked different, uncertain, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit wiser. In her room, Ella lay awake, thinking about the dinner party. She'd meant to humiliate Nate's friends, to show him what shallow people they were. But she hadn't expected to see that flash of real pain in his eyes when he realized the truth about them. For the first time since this began, she wondered if there might be more to Nathaniel Grant than she'd thought. A month had passed since the dinner party, and life at the Monroe Foundation had fallen into a routine for Nate. He no longer complained about the early mornings or the physical work. Something was changing in him, though he tried hard not to show it. One morning, while sorting through donation boxes, he found a familiar leather jacket. He'd bought one just like it last year for more money than most families spent on groceries in a month. "Nice jacket," said Tommy, a teenager who came to the foundation for help with job training. "Bet that cost more than my mum makes in a week." Nate looked at the boy, then back at the jacket. "You know what? You should have it." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Really? But Maria said designer stuff has to be sold." "I'll pay for it," Nate said, surprised by how good it felt to see the kid's face light up. "Consider it an investment in your future." What Nate didn't know was that Elle had been watching from her office doorway. She smiled to herself, marking another small victory in her notebook. Later that day, a familiar face walked through the foundation's doors. Jessica, wearing the plainest clothes she owned, which were still obviously expensive, looked around nervously. "Can I help you?" Nate asked, surprised to see his old friend. I've been thinking about what Elle said at dinner," Jessica admitted, "about helping people. I thought maybe I could volunteer." Nate studied her face, looking for any sign this was a joke, but Jessica seemed sincere, if uncomfortable. "We could always use more help in the clothing department," he said finally. "But fair warning, it's hard work, and Maria doesn't care how much your shoes cost." To everyone's surprise, Jessica stayed. She complained about her broken nails and the dust, but she stayed. By the end of the day, she'd helped 3 women pick out interview outfits, and her smile was genuine for the first time Nate could remember. Back at the penthouse that evening, Ella found Nate looking through his massive closet with a critical, "Spring cleaning?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Half of this stuff I've never even worn," he said, pulling out designer suits and shoes. "Do you think the foundation could use them?" Elle felt something flutter in her chest, but she kept her voice neutral. "I'm sure we can find them good homes." "You?" "No," Nate said slowly, still focused on his clothes. "I met a guy today who lost everything in a fire. No insurance, 3 kids to support. I was thinking maybe we could help him find an apartment." "We?" Ella raised an eyebrow. "Well, I mean the foundation," Nate backtracked quickly. "But I thought maybe I could look into some of my real estate contacts, see if anyone would be willing to offer affordable housing." Elle watched him try to act casual about it, like he wasn't suggesting using his connections to actually help someone. "That's not a bad idea," she said carefully. "Why don't you put together a proposal?" That night, Elle called her best friend, Sarah, for their weekly chat. "He's changing," Elle admitted, curled up on her bed with a glass of wine. "Today I caught him paying for a kid's college application fees out of his own pocket." "Isn't that what you wanted?" Sarah asked. "Yes, but..." Elle sighed. "It was easier when he was just the arrogant jerk who needed to be taught a lesson. Now he's human," Sarah suggested. Elle, honey, maybe it's time to admit this little revenge plan of yours is turning into something else. Don't be ridiculous, Elle said quickly. This is still just about teaching him a lesson. But later, as she passed by Nate's home office, she saw him working late, surrounded by papers. He was calling property managers, trying to set up a program for emergency housing assistance. The look of concentration on his face, the way he genuinely cared about making it work, it made something shift inside her. The next morning at the foundation, Maria cornered Elle in her office. That husband of yours, Maria said, crossing her arms, he's not as bad as you made him out to be. He's learning, Elle defended, then caught herself. Why was she defending Nate? Maria gave her a knowing look. And what exactly are you learning? Before Ella could answer, they heard a commotion in the main room. Nate was helping an elderly woman who had fainted in the heat. He'd given her his water, his suit jacket as a pillow, and was calling for medical help. His genuine concern was written all over his face. Look at him now, Maria said softly, and tell me this is still just about teaching him a lesson. Ella couldn't answer. She watched Nate comfort the old woman until the paramedics arrived, saw how he promised to check on her later, how he remembered her grandchildren's names from their intake interview last week. This wasn't the same man who had approached her outside the coffee shop with a cruel bet in mind. This was someone else entirely, someone who made her heart beat a little faster when he smiled, someone whose kindness was becoming as natural as his old arrogance had been. Oh no, Ella whispered to herself, finally admitting what she'd been trying to deny. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it had happened. Somewhere between trying to teach Nate Grant a lesson and watching him become a better man, Elle Monroe had started to fall in love with her own husband. 6 months into their marriage, summer arrived with record-breaking heat. The foundation was busier than ever, providing water and air, conditioners to elderly residents, and helping homeless families find shelter from the scorching temperatures. Nate wiped sweat from his forehead as he unloaded another truck of water bottles. He'd long since stopped wearing designer suits to work, switching to simple clothes that could handle physical labor. His old friends wouldn't have recognized him, but he didn't care anymore. You're going to get heat stroke, Ella said, appearing beside him with a cold bottle of water. Take a break. I'm fine, Nate insisted, but accepted the water. Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, sending an unexpected jolt through them both. Things had been different between them lately. The sharp edges of their arrangement had softened, replaced by something more complicated. They still slept in separate rooms, still maintained the pretense of their marriage being a lesson, but their eyes lingered on each other when they thought. The other wasn't looking. That afternoon, Elle's father made a surprise visit to the foundation. Richard Monroe was an imposing man in his 60s, known as much for his business genius as his overprotective nature toward his only daughter. "Daddy?" Ella hugged him, then noticed his serious expression. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," Richard said, glancing at Nate, who was helping a family carry boxes to their car. About him. In Elle's office, Richard got straight to the point. "The board is concerned, sweetie. This little experiment of yours, it's gone on long enough." "What do you mean?" Elle felt her stomach tighten. "We've been watching Mr. Grant." Richard pulled out a folder. "He's been making calls to real estate developers, trying to set up affordable housing programs. He's using his business connections to help your foundation. Isn't that a good thing?" "It's dangerous," Richard insisted. "The board thinks he's trying to work his way into the Monroe Empire through your foundation. They want me to shut down his projects, freeze him out." "That's ridiculous," Elle stood up. "Nate's not trying to take advantage. He's changed." "Has he?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Or is he playing a longer game? Remember, sweetheart, this is the man who married you as part of a bet." Before Elle could respond, they heard a commotion outside. A teenager had collapsed from the heat while waiting in line. Through the office window, they watched Nate rush to help, cradling the boy's head while calling for medical assistance. "Look at him, Daddy," Elle said softly. "Does that look like someone playing a game?" Richard watched thoughtfully. "Maybe not." But the board still wants proof that he's not a threat. They're sending an investigator to look into his past, his business dealings, everything. You can't do that, Elle protested. It's already done. Richard kissed her forehead. I'm just warning you because I love you. Be careful, sweetheart. Men like Nathaniel Grant don't change overnight. After her father left, Elle sat at her desk feeling sick. She'd started this whole thing to teach Nate a lesson, but now he was the one who might get hurt. The thought of investigators digging into his past, twisting his recent good works into something suspicious, made her chest ache. That evening, Nate found her still in her office, staring at nothing. Hey, he said softly, you missed dinner. I saved you some of that pasta you like. Elle looked up at him, really looked at him. His hands were calloused now from real work. His face was tanned from helping build the foundation's new community garden. His eyes, once cold with arrogance, now held genuine warmth when he looked at her. Why are you doing all this? She asked suddenly. Doing what? The housing program, the college fund for the kids, all of it. Is it just to prove something to me? Nate sat down across from her. At first maybe it was, but now... He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the words. These people, their stories, they matter to me. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that actually matters. Elle felt tears in her eyes. Even if it costs you everything, your reputation, your business connections. Elle, what's wrong? Nate leaned forward, concerned. Did something happen? She wanted to tell him about her father's visit, about the investigation, about how scared she was that her plan to teach him a lesson might end up destroying him just when he'd become someone worth loving. Instead, she stood up abruptly. I need some air. I'll come with you, Nate offered. No, Elle said too quickly. I need to be alone. She hurried out of the office, leaving Nate staring after her in confusion. In the elevator, Elle finally let her tears fall. She'd wanted to break down his walls, but somehow he'd broken down hers instead. Out on the street, Ella walked aimlessly, her mind racing. She had to find a way to stop the investigation, to protect Nate without him finding out. But more than that, she had to figure out what to do about the fact that she was hopelessly, terrifyingly in love with the man she'd married for revenge. Back at the foundation, Nate found Elle's phone on her desk. As he picked it up, a text message from her father lit up the screen. Investigators start tomorrow. Keep him away from the Monroe building. Nate stared at the message, his heart sinking. All this time, had Elle just been setting him up for a bigger fall? Or was there something else going on? Something that explained the tears he'd seen in her eyes. For the first time since their marriage began, Nate wasn't sure which would hurt more, finding out Elle was still playing him, or realizing she might actually care enough to try to protect him. The next morning, Elle arrived at the foundation early, hoping to catch Nate before he saw any signs of the investigation. But his office was empty, and Maria told her he hadn't come in. He called to say he's taking a personal day, Maria said, giving Ella a strange look. First time he's missed work since he started. Ella's heart sank. She tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Back at the penthouse, his closet was open, and some clothes were missing. On the kitchen counter, she found her phone with a note beside it. Saw your father's message. Guess some lessons take longer to learn than others. No, Ella whispered, her hands shaking as she picked up her phone. She had to find him, had to explain, but Nate was already across town, sitting in a coffee shop, the same one where this whole story had started. He stared at his own phone, looking at a text from Ella's father that had just come through. My office, 2 p.m., come alone. At 2 o'clock sharp, Nate walked into Richard Monroe's massive office on the top floor of the Monroe building. The older man stood at the window looking out over the city. Sit down, Mr. Grant, Richard said without turning around. I'll stand, thanks. Nate's voice was cold. Just tell me one thing. Was this the plan all along? Have Elle marry me, let me think I was changing, then destroy everything I've built? Richard turned around, studying Nate carefully. Actually, this might surprise you, but no. The investigation wasn't Elle's idea. In fact, she was quite upset about it. What? Sit down, son, Richard said more gently. We need to talk about my daughter. Nate sat, confused by Richard's tone. The older man pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the desk between them. "This is what our investigators found," Richard said. "Every business deal you've made in the past 6 months, every program you've started at the foundation, every penny you've spent helping people who needed it." "And?" Nate asked stiffly. "And I owe you an apology." Richard smiled slightly. "You're not the man I thought you were. More importantly, you're not the man Elle thought you were when she married you." "What are you talking about?" "Elle came to me the day after your wedding, told me everything about the bet, about her plan to teach you a lesson." Richard sat down heavily. "I thought she was crazy, but she was so sure she could make you see the error of your ways. What neither of us expected was for you to actually change." Nate's head was spinning. "The investigation was my idea," Richard admitted. "I had to be sure you weren't playing some long game. But these reports," and he tapped the folder. "You've spent almost half your personal fortune on foundation projects. You've worked harder than any of our paid employees, and you did it all without publicity, without trying to take credit. Because it wasn't about credit," Nate said quietly. "It was about doing something right for once in my life." Richard nodded slowly. "Elle tried to stop the investigation. She was afraid it would hurt you, afraid you'd find out and think she didn't trust you. She's been crying in her office all morning." Nate felt something in his chest tighten. "She has? You know what the funny thing is?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "When Elle first told me about her plan, she said she was going to teach you how to be a better man. Instead, you taught her how to be a better person too." "What do you mean?" "My daughter has always cared about helping people, but she kept herself distant, protected. Since being married to you, she's been different, more involved, more passionate. She's opened her heart in a way I've never seen before." Richard smiled. "Sadly, even if it means she might get hurt." Nate stood up abruptly. "I need to go." "Before you do," Richard held out a piece of paper. "You should know about this. Ella filed it this morning." Nate took the paper, his heart stopping when he saw what it was. Divorce papers, already signed by Ella. But instead of taking everything she could as the prenup allowed, she had signed away any claim to Nate's assets. She was walking away with nothing. "She said she couldn't bear to profit from hurting you," Richard explained softly. "Said you'd earned the right to keep everything you've worked for." Nate stared at the paper, remembering Elle's tears in her office the night before, understanding now what they meant. She hadn't been playing him. She'd been trying to protect him, even if it meant losing him. "Where is she?" he asked hoarsely. "Where do you think?" Richard smiled. "The same place she goes whenever she's upset, the same place you first met." Nate was out the door before Richard could say another word. Behind him, the divorce papers floated to the floor, unsigned on his side. Back in his office, Richard Monroe picked up his phone. "Maria?" "Yes, Elle's still at the foundation. Make sure she stays there. I think her husband might have something to say to her." In the elevator, Nate's heart raced as he thought about everything that had happened in the past 6 months. He'd married Elle thinking he was the one in control, never realizing that she would be the one to change his life completely. Now he just had to hope it wasn't too late to show her that the man she'd helped him become was the man who had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with her. Elle sat on the bench outside the coffee shop, exactly where everything had started, 6 months ago. She wore simple jeans and a t-shirt, no pretense, no disguise. Her eyes were red from crying, and she held a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Inside the coffee shop, Sarah watched her friend through the window with concern. She'd been sitting there for hours, refusing to move, as if waiting for something or someone. The afternoon crowd rushed past on the sidewalk, busy people hurrying to important meetings. None of them noticed the elegant Elle Monroe sitting on a shabby bench, looking lost and heartbroken. None of them except one. Nate stood across the street watching her. His tie was loose, his suit jacket missing, his hair messy from running his hands through it too many times. He looked nothing like the polished businessman who had approached her on this same spot half a year ago. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street. Elle was so lost in thought she didn't notice him until his shadow fell across her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked softly. Elle's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Nate, I've been trying to call you. I know. He sat down beside her, close but not touching. I had a very interesting meeting with your father. Ella's face crumpled. I'm so sorry. I tried to stop the investigation. I never wanted... He showed me the divorce papers, Nate interrupted. Quietly. Elle looked away, tears falling. You deserve your freedom. After everything I did. Everything you did. Nate turned to face her. You mean showing me what a shallow, selfish person I was? Teaching me that there's more to life than money and status? Helping me become someone I can actually be proud of? I manipulated you, Elle whispered. I played with your life. Yes, you did. Nate's voice was gentle. And I'm grateful for every minute of it. Elle looked at him in surprise. What? Do you know what I was before I met you? A joke. A rich boy playing at being a man, surrounded by fake friends and empty relationships. Nate reached for her hand. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. I was supposed to teach you a lesson, Elle said, her voice breaking. I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. The words hung in the air between them. Elle tried to pull her hand away, but Nate held on. When did it happen? He asked. When did you start to care? I don't know, Elle admitted. Maybe when you spent your whole weekend helping Tommy's family move into their new apartment. Or when you sold your Ferrari to fund the children's program. Or maybe it was every morning, watching you show up early to unload trucks and help families, never complaining, never asking for recognition. For me, Nate said slowly, it was the day you yelled at me for being rude to Maria. You were so passionate about treating everyone with respect, so fierce in defending people others might overlook. That's when I started to see the real you. The real me? Ella laughed bitterly. The real me tricked you into marriage. No, Nate squeezed her hand. The real you saw something worth saving in a man who didn't deserve it. The real you devoted your life to helping others instead of living off your fortune. The real you is the woman I fell in love with. Elle's breath caught. What did you say? I love you, Elle Monroe, Nate said simply. Not because of your money or your name, not because of some bet or lesson. I love you because you made me want to be better, because you saw the best in me even when I was at my worst. But the investigation, Elle started, proved what you already knew, Nate smiled, that the man you married on a bet isn't the same. Man sitting here now, your father actually apologized to me. I think that might be a historical first. A laugh bubbled up through Ella's tears. He does hate admitting he's wrong. There's just one problem. Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out the divorce papers, now wrinkled from being carried around. Ella's heart sank. Oh. These papers, Nate said seriously, are missing something very important. What? My signature. With deliberate movements, Nate tore the papers in half, then in quarters. Because I don't want a divorce, I want a real marriage with the amazing, frustrating, passionate woman who changed my life. Nate. Ella's voice trembled. Let me finish, he said, taking both her hands in his. I know we did everything backward. We got married before we knew each other, before we loved each other. So now I'm asking you, Elle Monroe, will you stay married to me? Not because of a bet or a lesson, but because we found something real in the middle of all our games. Around them, people hurried past on the sidewalk. Inside the coffee shop, Sarah pressed her hands to her heart, watching through the window. But Elle and Nate saw only each other. Yes, Elle whispered, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I'll stay married to you, you impossible man. Nate pulled her into his arms, kissing her as pieces of torn divorce papers scattered in the wind. It wasn't the kind of kiss they'd shared at their first wedding, cold and for show. This was real, full of love and promise and forgiveness. Sarah came out of the coffee shop carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. I think this calls for a celebration, she said, grinning at her friend. Actually, Nate said, not letting go of Ella, I have a better idea. What do you say we have another wedding? A real one this time, with no hidden agendas and no secret identities. Just us being honest about who we are and how we feel. Elle looked up at him, her heart full. I'd like that, but only if we do it at the foundation, with all our real friends there. You mean Maria can come yell at me on my wedding day? Nate pretended to look scared. The things I do for love. Elle laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. Looking at Nate now, she saw no trace of the arrogant man who had approached her on this bench 6 months ago. Instead, she saw the man she'd always hoped he could be, kind, genuine, and completely hers. 1 month later, the Monroe Foundation's main hall had been transformed. Simple white flowers decorated every surface, and strings of soft lights hung from the ceiling. It wasn't as fancy as most Monroe family weddings, but it was perfect for Elle and Nate. Stop fidgeting, Maria scolded Nate as she adjusted his tie. She'd insisted on being his best person, claiming someone needed to keep him in line. I'm nervous, Nate admitted. What if she changes her mind? After everything you two have been through. Maria shook her head. Not a chance. Now, remember, what I told you about the vows. Keep them simple and from the heart, Nate finished. I know. In another room, Elle stood in front of a mirror in a simple white dress. Sarah helped her with her hair, while Jasmine arranged her bouquet of wildflowers, picked from the Foundation's community garden. You look beautiful, Richard Monroe said from the doorway. And I've never seen you look happier. I am happy, Daddy, Elle smiled. Really, truly happy. I know. Richard kissed her forehead. I was wrong about him, you know, about both of you. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we don't plan. The ceremony was nothing like their first wedding. Instead of Nate's old society, friends, the room was filled with people from the Foundation, families they'd helped, volunteers they'd worked with, children from their programs. Tommy sat in the front row, proudly wearing his leather jacket. When the music started, Elle walked down the aisle on her father's arm. But this time, when she reached Nate, there were tears in both their eyes. 6 months ago, Nate began his vows, his voice shaking slightly. I thought I had everything, money, success, power, but I had nothing that really mattered. Then you came into my life, pretending to be someone who needed help, when really you were the one helping me. Elle squeezed his hands as he continued. You taught me that true wealth isn't in my bank account. It's in the lives we touch and the people we help. You showed me what real strength looks like, not in controlling others, but in serving them. You made me want to be worthy of the love I see in your eyes. Now it was Elle's turn, and her voice trembled with emotion. I thought I was so clever, teaching you a lesson about humility and compassion. But the biggest lesson was the one I learned myself. I learned that people can change when you believe in them. I learned that true love isn't about games or power or revenge. It's about seeing the best in someone and helping them become that person. She took a deep breath, smiling through her tears. You've become more than I ever dreamed possible, Nathaniel. Grant, not because I forced you to change, but because you chose to. And in choosing to be better, you taught me how to be better too. How to trust, how to forgive, how to love without walls or conditions. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as they exchanged rings, simple bands that meant so much more than the expensive ones from their first ceremony. By the power vested in me, the officiant said, I now pronounce you once again, but this time for real husband and wife. Their kiss was interrupted by cheering and applause. Tommy whistled loudly, making everyone laugh. Even Maria was wiping away tears, though she tried to hide it. At the reception held right there in the Foundation's hall, Ella and Nate danced their first dance as a truly married couple. Around them, Foundation families mixed with society folks, breaking down the barriers that had once seemed so important. Look, Elle whispered to Nate, nodding toward a corner where Jessica, still volunteering at the Foundation, was deep in conversation. With Tommy about his college plans. People can surprise you, Nate said, holding Elle close. I should know. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, Tyler appeared. He looked uncomfortable in the simple setting, but he came forward with determination. I owe you both an apology, he said seriously. That bet, it was cruel. I never thought. It turned out to be the best bet I ever made, Nate interrupted, smiling at Elle. Just not in the way any of us expected. As their guests began to leave, Elle and Nate stood in the doorway of the Foundation. Their foundation now, as Richard had announced during his toast that they would run it together. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Grant?" Nate asked, kissing her temple. "I was thinking," Elle said, leaning into him, "maybe we could stop by the coffee shop first, for old time's sake." Nate laughed. "The coffee shop where you tricked me into falling in love with you?" "No," Elle turned in his arms to face him. "The coffee shop where you taught me that sometimes the greatest love stories start with a lesson." As they walked down the street hand in hand, they passed the bench where their story had begun, but neither of them looked back. They were too busy looking forward to their future, a future built not on bets or games or lessons, but on the truest foundation of all: love that transforms, forgives, and makes us better than we ever dreamed we could be. Back at the foundation, Maria found a note from them on her desk. "Gone for coffee. Back on Monday to change the world together." She smiled, putting the note in her drawer next to the old newspaper clipping announcing their first wedding. That story had been about a bet between wealthy socialites, but this story, their real story, was about something much more valuable: the lesson that true love doesn't change people by force, but by believing in who they can become. And that was a lesson worth learning twice.